Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Norwich Talk, where there have been reports that Dean Smith has been relieved of his duties as Norwich City's head coach. This is going to be quite a short video. I think it's going to be more of a reflection, a very brief reflection on his time at Norwich City. We'll create and will endure some wishful thinking towards the end of the video in terms of who we want to come into the role. But I think I'll save the sort of juicy discussion in terms of who we want in for another time, for a stream. So if that's what you want, click off the video, I'll be honest with you. But Dean Smith gone as Norwich City head coach. The first thing I do want to say, and I kind of feel a bit sorry for him as a person, because having that sort of them chants chanted at you from a human perspective, it's like, ooh, that's quite brutal. But at the same time, as you know, especially as Norwich City head coach, you know what you're stepping into. You know what you're vulnerable to if your team are going to play like that, and you're going to make comments like the comments that he made. So I think it kind of balances itself out. I don't think it was ever really a personal hatred. You know, there are some tweets that you see, I won't mention names, where you think, right, why are you trying to drive a wedge between the fans and sort of try and blame everything on them? That was never really the case. It was just disgruntled fans who were fed up of watching their team play pathetically in a league that, you know, the Premier League, for example, where we kind of expect it and it's kind of like we can live with it. But in the Championship this season, it's not been good enough. And I think it says a lot about the quality of the Championship that Norwich City still sit in the top six. Although I believe between 5th and 16th or 15th, there's 3 points. So saying, oh, we're top six, we're still pushing for promotion, really isn't going to cut it anymore. As soon as you hear those chants at Carrow Road against Blackburn of Dean Smith out and Dean Smith, your football is not particularly good, you think, yeah, it's time up. You know, it's something we've been wishing for a while in terms of wanting a change, but it's finally here, and we can maybe have some optimism injected into our veins, a new sense of perspective, something to believe in, because it was stale. But not only was it stale, it was beginning to rot, and well, I think it began to rot a long time ago, but it was really kicking up a stink at Carrow Road, especially where the form was poor. The fans were fed up, and there was a lack of accountability, as I said earlier. But Dean Smith, in terms of his time at Norwich City, and I don't mean it as a personal attack on him, but there's no sort of polite way to say it, I think he's going to go down as one of the most forgettable Norwich City head coaches in our history. I do strongly believe he'll go on to have a successful career. However he defines successful, I don't know. But I do believe he'll go on to bigger and better things, because I don't think he's that bad of a coach. That's as nice as I think I'll be. But at Norwich City, it really wasn't meant to be. It kind of felt like, because he jumped straight back into the job, didn't he? He had about a week off from Villa, his dream job, to Norwich. It kind of felt like it was a club and a man who were both in need of a rebound after a very nice relationship, a very healthy relationship that had turned a little bit sour at the end. It seemed like there were two parties in need of a rebound, and Norwich City were ready to love again before Dean Smith was ready to. And by that I mean we had not necessarily gotten over Daniel Farker, but we were ready for another Daniel Farker, not a sort of stopgap, which Dean Smith was. And you know, I think Norwich City was always a stopgap for Dean Smith. You know, realistically, from both perspectives, the hire I don't think was silly at all. I was quite excited. He had a good track record, but we've seen over the last 13-14 months, it's just not been good enough at all. It really hasn't. The style of football was never implemented. You look in the Premier League, for a month they played with a little bit more energy, and that was about it. It then continued to just get worse and worse and worse. There was a couple of games where we flirted with the idea of playing quite well. I think Everton sticks out to me, Watford as well, as kind of decent games. But you look at sort of the state of play for those clubs. Watford obviously got relegated with us. Everton, God knows what Everton are doing with Frank Lampard. Hopefully he's not a name who gets linked with the job again. But yeah, in the Premier League, it was never going to work. We then thought, right, let's have a refresh. Let's have a shift of bodies, a change of personnel. Let's build something new. Let's implement a style. Let's get some culture going, because, you know, the club was in dire need of it after the standard that Daniel Farker had set in terms of philosophy, culture, principle. Execution, not necessarily. Well, in his last season in the Premier League anyway. But it never clicked. You know, Norwich City seemed to sort of win games, but we'd leave Carrow Road, and this is a point I'm fed up of making, and I'm relieved that I won't have to for a week or two. Well, I might still, but I'm not going to be blaming it on Dean Smith. we were scraping through games, we were getting lucky 1-0, 2-1s, whatever. And in my head, I always compared it to Daniel Farke's second title winning season, where it kind of felt like we were jamming our way along a bit. However, Daniel Farke's team did that. Dean Smith's team did that. Which is the defining difference with Daniel Farke. And again, you know, Dean Smith said it, he'd never had sort of the credit in the bank, whereas Daniel Farke did in that season. But you could always see what was going on. It was possession, it was high-flying fullbacks, it was creativity in the midfield to find Timu Puki, it was give the ball to Buendia and let him do everything. Dean Smith never had that player, but it's not really an excuse, is it? You know, you look at the beginning of this season, Norwich pressed for about a month. It seems to be a month and then the drop off. We pressed for about a month, sort of scraped our way through games. Players showed quality. You look at Josh Sargent stepped up to the mark when he was playing in the number 9 role. Timu Puki continues to score goals. You know, he continues to miss a few chances, but he still scores goals. Angus Gunn, I think, under Dean Smith when he's played, has been really, really good. But beyond that, you kind of have to look at the bigger picture, and you look at players like Max Aarons, Todd Cantwell, players who Daniel Farke got a hell of a lot out of, have seemingly regressed at such a young age. It almost seems like they're playing with shackles on, and the idea of pragmatism to get out of the Championship's a very viable one, but it's one that we're not used to. But two, it's boring. It's boring is what it is, and I think, you know, the joyride we had been on with Daniel Farke had set this precedent of, if we're not going to win, it's going to be entertaining, and Dean Smith had none of it, which is a real shame. And the interesting bit about this is the comments from Anthony Richards in his interview, Norwich's finance director, for those that don't know. He said, essentially, if Norwich don't get promoted, there'll probably have to be a fire sale. And it kind of got to a point where I was thinking, right, you look at Norwich's assets, who have you got? Andrew Omobamidele, Max Aarons, and that's probably about it. But who's buying those players for the money we'd need to generate to then rebuild and survive, essentially? Max Aarons was once upon a time a £35 million player, in my opinion. I often got laughed at, but I genuinely believed he was a 30 million at a minimum player. Right now, I'm thinking, well, who's going to pay 10 million for him? Which isn't necessarily an indictment on him. It's just his progression at Norwich City under Dean Smith has stalled significantly. And, you know, we always looked at the bigger picture with Daniel Farke. We looked beyond results on the pitch, didn't we? We looked at player development, we looked at culture, we looked at philosophy. And if you continue to look at all those things under Dean Smith, culture, there was never really a highlight on that. He never built a relationship with the fans. The players almost seemed to take a step back from the fans. There was never a Christoph Zimmermann, was there? You never looked at that squad and thought, where is the Christoph Zimmermann? Where's the player making the connection with the fans? Even if it was a player who didn't play much. You look at philosophy on the pitch, not one at all. I won't have it. I mean, not that anyone would ever say it, I don't think, as Norwich City fans now, but there was never a philosophy on that football pitch, which was tragic. And I can't remember what the other one was. But either way, the point remains the same with Dean Smith. The sacking is the right thing to do. Should it have been done sooner? I think so, but what's the point in saying that now? You know, if we don't complete the objectives from the season, it will always be a case of what if, and I'm sure we'll get tied down into that come the end of the season. But for now, the decision has been made. What next, Mr. Webber? I personally don't necessarily want Stuart Webber at my football club anymore. I don't really believe in his work. I've got to a position where I don't think he does. You know, there's been a radio silence from Norwich City, so the problems run deeper than Dean Smith. Dean Smith is a beginning, but at the very, very least, there needs to be one of these big, brave Stuart Webber interviews where he goes, oh, aim all your criticism at me. All right, we need one of those interviews. We need to know what you're thinking. It's not a hidden secret at all. It's not hidden at all that Stuart Webber runs our football club. And even when we didn't like what he was saying, it was good to hear it. It was good to know what the man who runs the club that we pay lots of money, we invest lots of interest in, it's good to know what he's thinking. We haven't had a clue. All we've seen is clips of him arguing with fans and, well, clips, I think one clip. But beyond that, it's been a radio silence. So for as much as this sacking is a positive step forward for Norwich City, we need some accountability at the very least. I think there'll be a lot of people out there who want the resignation of Stuart Webber, a shift in power. I'm not necessarily going to get into that for the moment because I don't think there's anything that can be said that's new or adds any value to the discussion. But yeah, it's a positive step. What do we want from the next manager as opposed to who do we want? I think that's an easier question to answer. We want someone who's going to be open and honest with us. We want someone who's going to try to create a connection with us. It doesn't even have to be the Daniel Farke Olays after a win. We just have to feel connected. And I don't think we can necessarily describe how that will look until we see it, until we feel it. But it's what we want, and it's what we have a right to ask for, essentially, as fans of this football club. We want a manager who's going to come in and not necessarily describe in a fine detail as to what style of football they're going to play, but let's outline some principles, shall we? Let's not give it the whole, we're going to be a different animal nonsense and then come out and play like purring kitties rather than the big lion that we were kind of promised. We want a manager who, on the pitch, is going to have a defined style. And do you know what? The thing is I'll speak for myself, but I also feel like I can speak for others in the sense of we understand we're going to have to be patient. The problem with Norwich City at the moment was we were being patient, but we didn't know what we were being patient for. Under Daniel Farke and under that regime, we always knew what it was. You could see on the pitch what the style was. And thankfully, it did essentially work out. And you look back on that time, it was a massive success. We were all grateful for it. It gave us wonderful memories. A couple of relegations, sure, but who cares? We were entertained until the end. Of Daniel Farke. We were being patient for essentially no reason, and eventually it got toxic. Things were starting to rot. Well, things got stale very quick under Dean Smith, and then it started to rot, and then it kicked up a massive stink. And, for the past few months, really, I would say weeks, but even before the World Cup, we were just fed up of watching a whole load of nothingness. And then a bunch of cop-out excuses, it was a whole, look at the stats, look at the XG, look at the possession, and it's borderline insulting to our intelligence as a group of people who go and watch a football match and to be told we're wrong, essentially. It was kind of like, all right, lay off a bit, will you? Have some accountability. You don't have to sit there and beg for forgiveness, but just be like, look, things aren't necessarily going the way we want it, but we're working to make it different. Here's how we're going to try and make it different. Let's have a bit of that. I'm going to have to catch my breath here because, goodness me, I didn't realise how much pent-up frustration I had towards the current regime. That is Craig Shakespeare, I believe, will follow Dean Smith. I can imagine there'll be a change in personnel of coaches. Goodbye to the set-piece coach, Alan Russell. Let's say goodbye to him sooner rather than later. Another thing as well that we want from a Norwich City perspective in terms of this self-financing model, we want a coach who is good at coaching players. Daniel Farke was that. Dean Smith, I don't know who's developed under him. There was the argument that Sargent had, but then he bunged him back out wide, didn't he? So yeah, I don't necessarily know who's particularly improved. There's an element of we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to wait to see a change in personnel because there are players in that squad who aren't good enough but will continue to play because there's no one there to replace them, essentially. You look at Ben Gibson as an option. Grant Hanley is kind of leaning that way. The left-back situation really isn't pleasant at all, which I think is a bit harsh, but also I'm not going to sort of mince my words. It really isn't particularly pleasant. You've got Max Aarons as basically the only right back. Mumba's out on loan. I don't think he'll ever make it at Norwich City. Sam Barham's always getting injured. You've got the midfield, Kenny McLean being the only player of the current expiring contracts to have signed a new contract. It's things like that make you just think, ooh. And then you've got players like Nunes on the bench. And the thing with Nunes is Dean Smith was never going to sort of find that right position for him. I think he's a player who needs an arm around the shoulder. He's a player who needs lots of individual coaching. Now, I don't know what goes on at Coney, but the only thing you can assume is that maybe he was being cast aside a bit because he was just on the bench. And yeah, do you know what? In a game, he's going to give the ball away 3, 4, 5 times, but he's also going to pick 3, 4, 5 wonderful passes. And when you're trying to entertain fans, when you're trying to play attacking football, you need that type of player. Emi Buendia was essentially that type of player, but he grew and he was coached well, where he would lose the ball much less and he'd create many more chances. It's a process, and Norwich still, I think they have the resources there to to do well, to get players in from overseas, to develop young players, to continue that part of the culture where we then develop our own income to buy players. I think the resources are still there. The training ground is wonderful. I like the South American connections because I think Sara and I think Nunes are wonderful sort of purchases, if you will, from the transfer market. I think the resources are there, as I've said about 500 times now. But something else needs to give. Which for me is Stuart Webber resigning and someone coming in to do his job, but differently, better, essentially. Or at the very least, as I said earlier, some accountability. Personnel, let's get into some names, shall we? For the last couple of minutes, Kjetil Knutsen is probably the first name that we all think of. He was heavily linked with the role at the same time that Frank Lampard was. Dean Smith was for about a week and then he was given the job. Frank Lampard is another name that I've seen tweeted. Good one, but I don't think anyone wants him, so I think we're okay there. Russell Martin, I've heard, I can't remember who it was in the comments now, but they've probably gasped at the idea of Russell Martin. I don't think he's the worst option. Let's put aside how he is as a player and how he is as a head coach, but I don't think there's any chance that Russell Martin will come in while Stuart Webber is still here. I'll give a special mention to Seth, who made that point in a group chat with me earlier, and I kind of thought, yeah, that's actually a really good point. Who else is there? Ralph Hasenhüttl. I'm not particularly sure he'd be interested in this job. He managed in the Premier League for a number of years and did all right at Southampton. Yeah, he was on the couple. He was on the end of a couple of 9-0s, but he also got them playing fairly decent football at times. I think he'll probably go back to Germany, in my opinion. But there are a few names just off the top of my head that you're probably going to see floating around. Who I want, I don't know. I'm going to have to go and do some of my own research into it. But yeah, that's all for this video. Clean slate from a head coach perspective, a footballing philosophy perspective. But from a club culture perspective, there are many questions still to be answered. Stuart Webber can continue his radio silence. He can continue to do whatever he's doing. But we need to hear from him. We need to hear from the man running our football club. We need to know what's going on. Essentially, that's the way it is. This whole season has just been a palaver, and it's been a sort of a vicious description, a very brutal description of the poor standard of the Championship, that Norwich City are still in the playoffs and still have a chance of getting promoted, especially with the squad they have at their disposal. But yes, Dean Smith sacked. A new chance for Norwich City to rejuvenate some of the fans' support, some of the fans' hope. Just anything at this point would be wonderful. Your thoughts in the comments down below, please. I would love to know them. I'd also love to know the names of potential managers. Doesn't have to be the one that you think will be it, just a few names that you'd be interested seeing thrown into the hat. We can discuss them in a live stream that I'll be doing soon. I'll see if I can line up some guests for that, so it's not just me on me lonesome. But yeah, that's all for this video. Thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'm sure you probably did because it's me talking about Dean Smith being sacked. Subscribe to if you fancy it, and I'll see you in the next one.